Okay, we're sitting here in Linnéastan, yeah, in Gothenburg, having a coffee with David Victorin, who it was the VD or president of Doctors Against
Nuclear
Weapons, or in Swedish it's
Läkare mot Järnvapen.
right. Now he's currently part of the board. Just stepped down a bit because of other pressing issues with his job, his profession. But anyhow, we're sitting here talking about nuclear weapons, and we were just discussing the change in attitude in Sweden now that Russia has become a threat again with their invasion of Ukraine and Putin's threat of using his nuclear arsenal.
Yes.
And so suddenly Sweden, which was a non-NATO country, really had no military engagements to amount to much since for about 200 years or so, is now moving into NATO. So you were talking about the change in perspective since the 1990s or something?
Yeah, the 1990s was the focus was still on national security mostly, and then when ICAN started, we and they managed to move the debate from national security and national security strategies to the human perspective and the humanitarian perspective of the actual effects of nuclear weapons.
Right.
And that no one can defend themselves against nuclear weapons.
Right. Nobody's safe in that scenario. Right. So, we were talking briefly about how that has changed. How do you feel it is today versus?
It's going with the NATO environment. It's going back to national security again and
Cold War type mentality.
Yeah, you're discussing defense strategies and not human safety or human. That is impossible to build up any kind of strategies against nuclear weapons when it's happening.
Yeah.
You can kill a city quite quickly.
Well, and with the weapons today, they're so much more powerful too than anything that ever existed back in the original days of Hiroshima and stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we're in a new stage in a way that when Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened, there was only United States in possession of nuclear weapons, and now we have 9 states in possession of nuclear weapons, and also 5 other NATO countries within Europe having nuclear weapons. And if one weapon is fired, we don't know what will happen. Probably, or
a domino effect.
Yeah, the retaliation, and that's the whole idea of the Cold War, that there will be retaliation, and whether that retaliation will stop with 1, 2, 5, 10 weapons, no one can tell.
Yeah, exactly. So with the Doctors Against Nuclear Weapons, how do they function to stop to try and change that mentality?
We try to say over and over again that there is no way to build a capacity to handle even one nuclear weapon.
Right.
You can't hide underground. You can't do anything to protect yourself. And with that insight, we need to focus on what we can do, and that is to prevent it from happening.
Right. Right.
Eventually to get rid of them, but all the time to reduce the risk.
Prohibition of them, yeah. You were talking earlier, you mentioned that one of the things you guys do at in the organization is lobbying against nuclear. So how does that work exactly here in Sweden?
We work with politicians, and we try to stress this all the time, that there's no way we can handle a nuclear weapon. It doesn't bring any safety. It brings more of a risk.
Right.
Safety. It's not a weapon. It's a political weapon.
So, but are you asking them to? Are you encouraging them to put in legislation or laws to somehow prevent the use of them, or to?
We try to make the government sign the TPNW, the treaty against the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, signed in the UN 2017.
The one that ICAN was involved with, right?
Yes.
Yeah. ICAN is the International
Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons.
Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, exactly. In fact, the president of ICAN was a Swedish woman, wasn't she?
Yes,
Yeah.
she was.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So getting Sweden, so they did sign in on that, didn't they? Or they
No,
didn't?
they didn't.
Why is that? Because they perceived that this thing with NATO was coming down the...
There's official reasons and there's unofficial reasons.
Okay. Politics, I get it. So they didn't sign on.
No.
And of course, America didn't sign on, and Russia,
No.
none of the nuclear
In
nations
fact,
signed on.
NATO stressed that no NATO country should sign, because NATO have a very clear nuclear weapons policy with the first use, and I'm not sure that everyone is aware that NATO has a first use policy of nuclear weapons.
In other words, they would strike if they had to.
It means that they could strike without being attacked with nuclear weapons themselves.
Really, that's part of their policy.
Yes.
Well, I didn't even know that. That's...
And not all countries with nuclear weapons have a first use policy.
But NATO does.
Yes.
So who makes that call in NATO? Is it sort of like everybody gets together and says, yeah, let's...
It's not actually that NATO have nuclear weapons themselves, but it's American nuclear weapons spread in NATO.
Okay.
And
So it would be America.
there's debate on whether that is a violation of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which states that the nuclear armed states should not spread nuclear weapons.
Right.
And whether that is a spread to distribute them within NATO, that's a question of debate.
Yeah, and if you look at it from that perspective, NATO is a beast of its own. Then, just as sort of a danger.
Well, at least there's no safe hands of nuclear weapons.
There just is not.
No.
And
And if you ask the victims of a nuclear disaster, it's not very important to them who fired the weapon.
Yeah, it's the fact that it was used.
And it's not important if the firing was in retaliation or not.
Right.
The disaster will be the same.
Yeah, that's not going to be the discussion if there's a nuclear war.
No.
It's just going to be the millions or billions that die.
Yeah.
And I think
millions or hundreds of thousands in one detonation.
Yeah,
And millions in a regional war.
in a regional
And
war.
billions
On a global
great
scale.
global scale
Yeah.
due to climate effects that are very hard to model.
The other thing that I think that people don't realize today, even generally speaking, is that if there were like a number, I don't know how many of nuclear bombs that would have to be exploded, it would have massive effect on the climate of the planet.
Yes, most probably yes.
And that's because of the effect on the atmosphere, the warming,
Yes, the soot that will
the soot that will go up.
from
Yeah,
the fires, from the great fires, will come up in the atmosphere and high up in the atmosphere and
block the sun.
exactly, and the atmosphere very up high is more stable, and the soot will stay there for longer.
Right.
Alan Robock is one of the scientists doing research on this effect.
It's like when they had that, what was it, Krakatoa was a big volcano that exploded in down near Malaysia, I think it was, back in 1890. Apparently, the amount of soot that it put in the atmosphere actually darkened the skies for like several years.
Yes, and that's the closest we can get to a model of a nuclear weapon.
Of a nuclear weapon, exactly. So it would have a disastrous effect on the climate if you didn't die from radiation.
Somehow probable. The question is for how long
Yeah.
and how much.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, well, from your position, then you're still involved with Doctors Against Nuclear Weapons. What would be your message to people in general? What can they do, like, about it?
Still to say that there's no way that we can handle. We can never build a capacity to handle even one nuclear weapon. There's no protection against nuclear weapons.
So what should they do? Speak up about it?
Yes, to stress on the politicians that we don't want to build our security policy based on nuclear weapons.
Good.
And that's possible.
Yeah.
One step at a time, in the right direction. It's possible, of course.
Of course, anything is possible. If we can send rockets to Mars, we can definitely do that.
And also to believe that we can continue having nuclear weapons without them ever being fired. That is the thing.
That's a fantasy,
naive.
isn't
That's
it?
naive.
Yeah, that's just naive.
Yeah.
And I think that the message that came out after 1945 when the bombs were dropped in Japan, and it was basically, I think, a propaganda campaign from America, was that they needed to have nuclear weapons to keep the peace. But I think that's a fallacy.
It's very hard to tell. It's very hard to tell, but there are people saying that that Soviet declared war against Japan was very important for Japan surrendering. It's very hard to tell in the retrospect.
Okay, well, very good. I think that kind of sums it up then. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you so much.
We'll be posting this on our website.
Sure.
Okay.
See you.
Yeah.